the Phantom Hitchhiker of Highway 167. Back in the late 1970s, Louisiana State Trooper Charles Chuck McCoy experienced an incident that still chills him to this day. Trooper McCoy had heard the legends of Highway 167, where motorists reported encounters with a ghostly hitchhiker who would vanish without a trace. Many believed the stories were just local folklore, but one night, McCoy found out firsthand that something far more sinister lurked on that stretch of road. It was a hot, humid summer night, and McCoy was on patrol. Around 2:30 a.m., while driving along the desolate highway, he spotted a young woman standing by the side of the road. She looked distressed, her clothes torn and dirty, and she appeared to be waving for help. Assuming she had been in some kind of accident, McCoy pulled over to assist. The woman, pale and visibly shaken, told McCoy that her car had broken down a few miles back and that she needed a ride to the nearest town. Her voice trembled, and she seemed unusually anxious, constantly looking over her shoulder as if something was following her. McCoy assured her she was safe and told her to get into the car. As they drove, McCoy tried to ask her questions about what had happened, but she remained mostly silent, only offering vague, nervous responses. After a few miles, the woman suddenly became agitated, pointing to an old farmhouse up ahead. "That's where I need to go," she said, her voice urgent. McCoy pulled into the driveway of the rundown house, but something didn't feel right. The place looked abandoned, with broken windows and overgrown weeds covering the yard. As he turned to ask the woman if she was sure this was the place, he was met with an empty passenger seat. She was gone. The door hadn't opened, there was no sign of her, and the seatbelt was still fastened. McCoy's heart raced as he got out of the car and searched the surrounding area. It was as if the woman had vanished into thin air. Confused and disturbed, McCoy radioed in the incident, but when backup arrived, there was no trace of the woman. Even more unsettling was when local law enforcement told McCoy that the old farmhouse had been abandoned for years, and that several other officers had reported picking up the same woman, only to have her disappear in a similar fashion. Locals believed the woman was the spirit of a hitchhiker who had been murdered along Highway 167 decades earlier. According to legend, she had been left for dead near the farmhouse and now roamed the highway, forever trying to reach her destination, but never able to escape the place where she met her tragic end. Trooper McCoy never patrolled that stretch of highway alone again, haunted by the memory of the phantom hitchhiker who vanished without a trace. The disappearance in the desert. In the summer of 2010, Officer Ryan Miller was patrolling the remote stretches of Nevada's desert highways, known for long stretches of nothingness and blistering heat. He was used to strange occurrences out in the desert, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened that day. It was just after midnight when a call came in about a single vehicle stranded on the edge of U.S. Route 50, also known as the loneliest road in America. Miller was dispatched to the scene, expecting to find someone with a broken-down car or a flat tire. As he approached the location, his headlights illuminated an old pickup truck parked awkwardly on the side of the road. The driver's side door was wide open and the engine was still running. Miller stepped out of his patrol car, calling out for anyone nearby. The desert was eerily silent, and the oppressive heat still lingered even at that late hour. He approached the truck cautiously, checking inside. There was no sign of the driver. The dashboard radio was still on, playing an old country tune, but there was something odd. An empty shotgun was propped against the passenger seat with the smell of freshly fired rounds still in the air. A few feet from the truck, Miller noticed something unsettling. footprints in the dirt, leading out into the vast desert. Whoever had been driving the truck had walked off into the wilderness without any gear or water, an almost certain death sentence in those conditions. Miller followed the footprints for about a quarter of a mile when they abruptly stopped. There were no other tracks, no sign of a struggle, no tire marks, and certainly no indication that the person had doubled back. It was as if the driver had simply vanished into thin air. Miller called in for backup, and a full search was launched. Despite extensive efforts, neither the driver nor any further evidence was ever found. Locals began to speculate about paranormal explanations, rumors of mysterious lights in the desert, strange sightings, and even abductions by extraterrestrial forces. Some even claimed the area was cursed, tied to Native American legends, warning people not to venture too far into the desert. For months after the incident, Officer Miller couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something otherworldly had happened that night. He continued his patrols, but every time he passed that stretch of Route 50, he couldn't help but glance into the vast, empty desert, wondering what had taken the man, and if it might one day come for him too. The Phantom Hitchhiker of Highway 167. Trooper McCoy couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the hitchhiker flickered in his mind. Her pale, distressed face, and the haunting moment she vanished without a trace. He tried to rationalize it, but the more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. He wasn't a rookie. He knew what he saw. The next day, McCoy returned to the station and started asking around. Several of the older troopers exchanged glances, muttering that McCoy wasn't the first to see her. They spoke of a local legend, stretching back decades. A young woman, dressed similarly to the one McCoy had picked up, was said to have been killed in a hit-and-run accident on that exact stretch of Highway 167. The story goes that she still haunts the road, looking for a ride that'll take her home, one of the older officers said, leaning back in his chair, his voice a mix of caution and resignation. Only she never makes it home. McCoy wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, not until now. But as the days turned into weeks, he couldn't shake the encounter. He even drove the same route several times, hoping to catch another glimpse of the woman or find an explanation, but she was nowhere to be found. It was as if she'd never existed. That was until a month later. It was nearing midnight again when McCoy was dispatched to the same stretch of highway. This time, a driver reported a woman walking along the shoulder, looking like she was in distress. His heart raced as he arrived at the scene. The description was identical. The torn clothes, the same pale face. When McCoy approached her, she was standing in the exact same spot as before. His hands trembled as he called out to her, but she didn't turn around. Slowly, he walked toward her, the air around them becoming unnaturally cold despite the summer heat. Just as he was about to touch her shoulder, she turned to face him. Her eyes were wide, filled with terror. "You need to help me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're coming." McCoy froze. "Who's coming?" he asked. But before she could respond, the temperature dropped sharply and a dense fog rolled in from nowhere, enveloping the entire highway. The woman's figure began to blur in the mist, and before McCoy could react, she disappeared again, right in front of him. But this time, she wasn't alone. As the fog thickened, McCoy felt a presence behind him. Turning around slowly, his flashlight illuminated something that made his blood run cold. Silhouettes, several of them, emerged from the fog, their forms twisted and unnatural, like they were trapped between this world and the next. Their faces were obscured, but their shapes were human, looming toward him in the mist. Heart pounding, McCoy stumbled back toward his patrol car, fumbling for his radio. "Officer in need of assistance. Highway 167, mile marker 22. He shouted into the radio, his voice barely steady. The figures kept approaching, their forms flickering in and out of the fog like shadows that didn't belong in the natural world. McCoy scrambled into his car, slammed the door, and sped off, the mist swirling in his rearview mirror. He didn't stop until he was several miles down the road, where the fog abruptly lifted, leaving him alone in the moonlit desert. When backup arrived, there was no sign of anything unusual. No fog, no figures, no hitchhiker. But McCoy knew what he saw. After that night, McCoy's career in law enforcement was never the same. He couldn't patrol Highway 167 anymore without feeling the weight of eyes watching him from the fog. He eventually transferred to a different precinct, but the memories lingered. Years later, McCoy received a call from a fellow officer who had taken over his old route. The younger officer described picking up a woman on Highway 167, a woman who matched the description of McCoy's hitchhiker perfectly. But when they arrived at her destination, she had vanished. "They're coming," the young officer said, repeating the same phrase McCoy had heard that night. McCoy's heart sank. He knew the woman's spirit would never find peace, and whoever they were still out there, waiting. The Disappearance in the Desert, Part 2. Officer Ryan Miller couldn't forget the abandoned truck and the driver's mysterious disappearance. It haunted him for weeks. The desert was vast and unforgiving, but people didn't just vanish without a trace, especially with no signs of foul play. What unsettled him the most was how abruptly the man's footprints had ended, as if he had simply stepped off the face of the earth. Determined to get answers, Miller dug into old case files, searching for any similar incidents along US Route 50. He wasn't prepared for what he found. Over the past 50 years, several reports had surfaced of cars being found abandoned along that same stretch of road, their drivers missing and never found. The cases spanned decades, but none had ever been solved. Each time, the driver's footprints led into the desert, only to vanish. Miller's obsession with the case grew, and soon he was spending his off hours driving the loneliest road, looking for anything that might provide a clue. It wasn't long before he started seeing things, strange lights hovering in the distance, flickering just beyond the horizon. At first, he thought they were nothing more than desert mirages, tricks of the heat. But the lights didn't behave like normal atmospheric phenomena. They moved with purpose, darting across the sky before disappearing just as quickly as they had come. One night, as Miller was driving his usual route, he spotted a set of headlights far ahead on the road, blinking erratically. As he approached, he realized it was another abandoned car, an old sedan, engine still running, just like the pickup truck he'd found weeks earlier. His pulse quickened. This couldn't be a coincidence. He pulled over and approached the vehicle cautiously. The driver's door was open, and inside was a half-finished cup of coffee, still warm. A set of footprints led away from the car, disappearing into the dark desert just like before. Miller hesitated. His instincts screamed for him to call for backup, but something urged him to follow the tracks on his own. He grabbed his flashlight and followed the footprints into the endless stretch of sand. After about a half mile, the tracks once again came to an abrupt stop. But this time, something was different. In the beam of his flashlight, Miller could see a strange pattern in the sand. Circles, perfectly smooth and symmetrical, as if something had landed there. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and Miller's flashlight flickered. He spun around, shining the beam in every direction, but saw nothing, only the dark, oppressive desert stretching out around him. Then, just beyond the edge of his vision, the lights appeared again. But this time, they weren't on the horizon. They were close, too close. The lights hovered just above the ground, surrounding him, panic surged through Miller as the hum grew louder, vibrating through his body. He ran back toward the road, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The lights followed, flickering in and out of existence like phantoms. The closer they got, the more disoriented Miller became, his vision blurring, his legs growing weak. It felt as though something was pulling him toward the lights, as if gravity itself had shifted. Just as Miller reached the road, the lights vanished and the hum stopped. He collapsed by the side of his patrol car, gasping for air, the desert once again silent. He never reported what happened that night. Who would believe him? But deep down, he knew that the desert held secrets far older and far more dangerous than anyone realized. And the people who disappeared along Route 50? They hadn't just gotten lost. Something, or someone, had taken them. A silent 911. Call it was late fall in a small Pennsylvania town, the kind of place where nothing much ever happened. The trees were shedding the last of their colorful leaves, and a cold, biting wind swept through the streets. Officer Lisa Ramirez was nearing the end of her night shift at the local police department, grateful that it had been an unusually quiet evening. As she sipped her coffee, hoping the last few hours would go by without incident, the phone rang at dispatch. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher answered. There was silence on the other end. A few seconds passed before the dispatcher repeated, "Hello? Is anyone there?" More silence. The dispatcher, following protocol, kept the line open and traced the call to a house on the outskirts of town, a place Officer Ramirez recognized. The old Crenshaw house had been abandoned for years after a tragic fire that had claimed the lives of the entire Crenshaw family. The fire had been a mystery. No one could ever figure out how it started or why no one managed to escape. Locals had long considered the place cursed, and over the years, rumors spread of strange occurrences there. Lights flickering in the windows, shadowy figures spotted in the distance, and voices coming from within, despite the house being boarded up. Ramirez felt a chill run down her spine as she received the address from the dispatcher. "A prank, probably," she muttered to herself as she grabbed her keys and headed out. But deep down, she knew something about this didn't feel right. She had heard the stories about the Crenshaw house growing up, and now she was heading there alone in the dead of night. The drive was short, but eerie. As she turned onto the narrow road leading to the property, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The moon was nearly full, casting an ominous glow over the landscape. The house loomed ahead, dark and silent. Its windows were still boarded up, just as they had been for years, the charred remains of the structure standing as a grim reminder of the tragedy. Ramirez parked her car at the edge of the overgrown driveway and stepped out, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She approached the front door cautiously, scanning the area. No lights, no signs of anyone being there. She knocked, more out of habit than expectation, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. "Police! Anyone inside?" she called out. There was no response. Ramirez felt a strange pull, as if something in the house wanted her to enter, but every instinct in her body screamed to stay away. She pushed the feeling down and radioed in her location, letting dispatch know she was checking out the situation. No one answered her radio call, just static. Frowning, she repeated the call, but the radio remained dead. Unease gnawed at her as she tested her flashlight. The beam flickered, then went out entirely. Ramirez cursed under her breath, giving the flashlight a hard shake. Nothing. She was alone, standing in front of a house she had no business being near, with a dead radio and a broken flashlight. But she couldn't ignore the 911 call. Steeling herself, she tried the front door. Surprisingly, it wasn't locked. It creaked open with a groan, the stale air inside hitting her like a wall. She entered slowly, her hand instinctively resting on her holstered gun. The house was exactly as she remembered it. Ruined, blackened walls and burnt debris scattered across the floor. The faint smell of smoke still lingered in the air, even after all these years. Ramirez's footsteps echoed through the empty hall as she made her way deeper into the house. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, no voices. But something felt wrong, terribly wrong. The air was heavy, oppressive, and it was getting colder by the second. Her breath began to fog in front of her as the temperature plummeted. Then from upstairs she heard it, a soft, muffled sobbing. Ramirez froze, her hand tightening around her gun. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was crying. Slowly she crept toward the staircase, the sound growing louder with each step. It wasn't the kind of sobbing you'd expect from someone in physical pain. It was deeper, more desperate, as if the person had been trapped in sorrow for a long, long time. "Hello?" Ramirez called out, her voice barely a whisper. "Is anyone there?" The sobbing continued, coming from one of the bedrooms on the second floor. Every nerve in her body screamed to leave, but she couldn't ignore it. Someone needed help. Ramirez climbed the stairs, her boots creaking on the charred wood. As she reached the top, the sobbing stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Her flashlight flickered back to life, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She stood in front of the bedroom door, the one where, according to the reports, the youngest Crenshaw child had died in the fire. Her heart pounded as she pushed the door open. The room was empty. The walls were blackened, the furniture reduced to ash. But there, in the middle of the room, was something that hadn't been there before. A small, charred teddy bear, its fur singed and matted. Ramirez stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. She'd read the reports. The Crenshaw boy had died clutching his favorite teddy bear. But this wasn't possible. The house had been cleared out after the fire. Nothing had been left behind. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Ramirez whirled around, but there was no one there. Her flashlight flickered again, and this time she heard a voice. It was faint, a whisper carried on the cold air, but it was unmistakable. "Help me!" Ramirez's blood ran cold. The voice was coming from behind her, from the very spot where the teddy bear lay. Slowly, she turned back toward it, her heart racing. The air around her felt thick, heavy, like she was being watched. Then, the sobbing began again, but this time it was all around her, echoing from the walls, louder, more frantic. Her instincts took over. She bolted for the door, wrenching it open and running down the stairs. The sobbing followed her, growing louder with every step, as if the very walls were crying out in anguish. She burst out of the front door and into the cold night, gasping for breath. The house stood behind her, dark and silent once again. Ramirez didn't stop running until she reached her patrol car. As she fumbled for her keys, the radio crackled to life. "Officer Ramirez, are you there?" "What's your status?" Dispatch's voice broke through the static. Breathing heavily, Ramirez grabbed the radio. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice shaking. "There's no one here." She glanced back at the house, its dark windows staring back at her like empty eyes. She knew she couldn't explain what had just happened. No one would believe her. But as she drove away, Ramirez couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still inside, waiting. And as she glanced in her rearview mirror, she saw it. The faint outline of a figure standing in one of the upstairs windows watching her leave.